Thank you, Mr. Popczycki. I took statistics 3 times. You're very passionate about something that I can't even remember without having pain. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to continue and move along here. So we're going to have question and answers at the end, and we had some a few minutes ago. So what I would like to do is introduce Professor Grzegorz Berendt, University of Gdańsk, Poland, and let me see, Poles and Jews under German occupation, Gross's thesis, reconsidered. Professor Berendt. Ah, there he is. About 10 minutes. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, the German state led by the Nazis during the World War II sought to estimate no fewer than 70 million innocent human lives, including millions of Jews and Roma and tens of millions of Slavs. In the case of Poles and Christians, only 15% of the population was to the left alive. The architects of the genocide persuaded this goal and acted accordingly, depending on the situation on fronts and Germany's need for food and labor. One of the basic methods to achieve this goal, implemented as early as in the first weeks of war, was to antagonize various groups of the population in occupied areas in accordance with the old Roman principle, divide and rule. This policy was introduced in all occupied territories, but today I will discuss its application in the occupied Poland. In order to facilitate the implementation of the genocide policies, Germany had planned to rip Polish society apart by fueling or generating ethnic conflicts. This method was executed through German officials and officers active at all levels of the occupation apparatus. Among other things, the occupants strived for Christians to approve of the actions aimed at the Jewish population. One of the important questions related to the Holocaust in general is how the Christian population, including Poles, reacted to German efforts aimed at winning approval towards anti-Jewish actions. In the case of Poles, the simplest way to evaluate this phenomenon would be to define the standpoint of civilian and military independent structures established in the occupied country and in exile. Overall possibilities to take action to hamper the actions of the German occupants were rather limited. But it is beyond dispute that from the first to the last day of the war, Polish official agendas condemned all discriminatory and extermination actions against Jews. An important manifestation of such a viewpoint was to raise the awareness of extermination process among the Western allies. On the other hand, institutional actions to save thousands of Jews were undertaken relatively late, I mean only in the autumn of 1942 and more broadly only from December that year. Soldiers and civilian members of the underground provided organized support to help several thousand people to survive. Help was distributed until the final days of the German occupation. For example, cash benefits to cover every expenses were paid out even as late as in February 1945. The facts show that the leaders of the Polish state against, adopted a position similar to that of the government of the Western Allies, recognizing that in wartime conditions, the main means of helping Jews was to overcome the Third Reich as quickly as possible, with the natural focus on military actions. Yet, no armed conspiracy in any of the occupied European countries was able to stop terror and save millions from dying at the hands of the oppressors. At the same time, efforts were made to make genocide perpetrators aware that they would not go unpunished. Already in January 1942, the Allies issued a warning to the Germans that those of them and their helpers who had committed crimes would be prosecuted and severely punished. Similarly, Polish institutions warned the public against collaboration and acting to the detriment of fellow citizens, and that the punishment for doing so would be imminent. This is how it worked. Collaborators died at the hands of the executors sent against them by the Polish state. However, the first sentences for harming Jews and against people helping to prosecute Jews were executed only in the second half of 1943, and there were relatively few of them. The Polish state elites categorically condemned the German Nazi anti-Jewish policy, but we must not forget that in real numbers, these elites were only a fraction of a Polish society. Therefore, the question arises, what was the position of about 24 million Poles, Christians, toward the crimes committed against Jews, and what determined that position? The factors of influence important in this context can be divided into two basic groups. The first one was the experience and attitudes from the earlier pre-war period. From the statements of thousands of Poles who were awarded with title of varieties among the nations, we know that an important motive for their deeds was religion and the Christian desire to help a neighbor facing death. But there were other premises to act human. A significant part of those who helped were people who were not religious but simply opposed racism. We have heard of devout pre-war anti-Semites who would condemn anti-Jewish actions of the Germans and try to help Jews on their own. So a name of a priest, Marceli Godlewski, was mentioned. Today we can name other people. On the other hand, some people who shared anti-Jewish prejudice before the war, for this very reason, were indifferent or even approving of the suffering inflicted on the Jews. But we are unable to determine the scale of such attitudes. We can name examples, but it is impossible to tell the numbers, the percentage. The most important factors determining Polish-Jewish relations were those generated by aggressors after September 1st, 1939. To a certain extent, Polish-Jewish relations in the eastern borderlands occupied by the Soviets for 22 months were put to the test when left-oriented activists, some members of national minorities, helped the Soviets to destroy local social elites, many Poles. Thousands of Jews, among others, contributed to the purges. The victims of those repressions and their families kept the memory of repression until after June 22nd of 1941, when the borderlands, Kresy, were seized by Germans. The immediate result were acts of revenge. Already in September 1939, the Poles were struck by the terror of the German army and police formation. The occupiers implemented regulations that provided for severe penalties for refusal or improper execution of orders from the German authorities. Almost always, they were provided for the possibility of the death penalty. An example is the ordinance for the so-called Polish police in the General Government from 17 December 1939. And I choose only two photographs to show you, and here you have part of the last page of this ordinance. I have to stress that for the unknown reasons, this ordinance was not published. Other ordinances were published in an official publication signed by Hans Frank. This ordinance was circulated only in such copies through the occupied Poland in the general government. And look at the last part of the ordinance. What is characteristic? Because from the very beginning, from the very first ordinances issued and signed by Hans Frank, there was always a remark that disobedience will be punished, and generally the capital punishment was mentioned. And here you must note that former pre-war officers of Polish state police were ordered to go back to service on the condition that refusing will be punished with death. And here in the Article 10 of the ordinance, you can see that not following orders of a German superior can be punished on the spot and up to the decision of the German superior, also the capital punishment. So what it meant practically? That such a gendarme or a police officer could simply shut down a Polish officer on spot. And thousands of public executions, and one more information referring the so-called blue police. And another thing, look at in what way the name of this auxiliary police is presented in this ordinance with an adjective in small letters and a noun according to a German orthography with a large letter. So it means that it is not a formal name. The Polnische Polizei. So it's something like a description of an institution subordinated to German superiors. But what is also connected to the issue? If a Pole decided to desert from so-called blue police from April 1942, the punishment also fell on his family. Thousands of public executions in cities and rural areas, imprisonment in jails and camps were proof that those were not empty threats. Punishment for disobedience fell on the Aryans and Jews alike. In the whole of occupied Poland, the Germans punished people for bringing illegal help to Jews. Appropriate regulations were issued in the general government, but the repressions were also applied outside its territory. The greatest bravery is never shared by the majority of the population, and helping the Jews required such bravery. There is no doubt that most of the Jews who survived on the so-called Aryan side, I mean outside ghettos and the German camps, owed this to private individuals, their sacrifice and courage. There were thousands of such people, but we know of no more than 10,000 by name. Thousands of others will remain nameless. While all of the above is true, there is no historical research that would confirm the commitment of more than tens of thousands of Poles to helping Jews in the whole country. For example, in Drohobycz, no more than 80 out of 20,000 inhabitants of the town were involved in rescuing about 200 Jews. This is how much is cited by known sources, 80 out of 20,000. While goodness was punished by the occupants, evil and meanness were rewarded. There is a well-known saying, "Death is the master from Germany." I will dwell on this thought by referring to the Polish wartime reality. The Germans also turned out to be the masters in the sphere of propagating menace. The occupants systematically depraved the society. Partially, this brought the effect that Germans had expected. Terror and bribery caused tens of thousands of people to become entangled in collaboration practices, primarily those that were forced to carry out the orders of their German superiors. First of all, I mean here the members of so-called auxiliary police, blue police, Ukrainian police, Belarusian police, but we must remember that these people were former Polish citizens. Millions of Polish citizens were deprived of their previous sources of income, and several million had to change their place of residence. German economic policy was tantamount to looting most of the pre-war cash resources from Poles and Jews. And we cannot forget that most of property of cash at the territory of half of the country, I mean the Soviet occupation, was robbed by the Soviets during these 22 months. So, and this fact, it is important to understand that in first place, finding one's way back in the conditions of homelessness and material poverty had priority over everything else. When we discuss the German occupation of Poland, we must not forget that, apart from utter terror, the majority of the population experienced a daily struggle to obtain basic means of subsistence. A small part of Poles, mainly in bigger cities, were able to offer selfless help to anyone. The survival of one's own family was top of the list. Such dreadful conditions were deliberately created by the German social policy. The above-mentioned factors determining Polish-Jewish relations in the reality of the German occupation are obvious to everyone who knows the reality of those times, either from autopsy or from research. Today, Studies, however, studies are being published whose efforts practically overlook the inhuman living conditions the Germans created and focus mainly on the reactions of those subjected to the occupants' policies. The studies are being created within the circle of the so-called New Polish School of Holocaust Research. There are attempts to redefine concepts and to apply the principle of collective responsibility. A picture is being created in which several dozen million people were supposed to feel satisfied watching the murder of millions of women and children, and men, of course. These tens of millions of people are portrayed as so-called facilitators, because this is how the English term bystanders began to be translated. Terrorized communities unable to undertake aid actions themselves are presented as supporting crimes. These arguments overlook the fact that the majority of Jews also focus on the daily struggle for survival of their families, not on the armed struggle against German oppressors. Double standards apply. Christian passerbys watching passively as Jews are put to death are credited en bloc with indifference fueled by their alleged anti-Semitism, overlooking the fact that the Jews forced to witness the execution of their fellow believers were passive alike. Any negative behavior recorded by eyewitnesses is extrapolated onto entire local communities, while empathy and mercy are reduced to instances of individual sacrifice. In their testimonies, survivors often admit that they are not sure whether they would have had the courage to bear the risk that the Poles rescuing Jews took on their shoulders. These eyewitnesses' accounts are generally ignored in the discussions on Polish-Jewish relations under German occupation. On the other hand, generalization about the supposedly universal, even overwhelming satisfaction of Christians with the tragedy experienced by Jews are approved of. There are also voices that one should not question any of the survivors' eyewitness accounts. This is contrary to the basic requirements of a historian's methodology, whose professional duty is to verify the sources of information and communicating the truth. What is more, owing to methodological research, we now know that in order to promote the negative model of Christian neighbors' behavior toward Jews, the accounts that go against such a model are often purposefully ignored. Such practices are objectionable and, at the same time, surprising. Surprising because the accounts of those tragic events and of mutual relations between Jews and non-Jews that we glean from various sources are sufficiently depressing. There is no need for falsification. Tens of thousands of Polish Jews survived the war owing to the help they got from their Christian fellow citizens of various nationalities. They were saved and are grateful to their saviors, but almost all of them also experience menace from some other Aryans. Sometimes those who offer help for a financial reward eventually turn Jews in. I have learned all of this while researching thousands of historical accounts. Therefore, I found it hard to understand why today the blame of those who were mean is put upon upon 10 of millions of other people. Józef Mackiewicz wrote years ago that only the truth is interesting. I fully agree with this thesis. I believe that those that quote the number of hundreds of thousands or even a million Poles risking their lives to save Jews are far from the truth. There's no confirmation of such a scale. They ignore the simple fact that horrible terror, the wretched, inhuman social conditions the Germans purposely impose often cripple the basic human instinct to help the one in need. At the same time, suggestions that Polish Christians, as a multi-million strong community, were an accomplice in the German plan to exterminate Jews are utterly false and ungrounded. Quite on the contrary, Polish Christian citizens, just like Polish Jewish citizens, were the object of Nazi German genocidal policies. Thank you very much.
Thought I had a new watch there. Thank you, Professor Berendt.